Today we're going to dive into jigs and we're going to pluck out the 5 most common ones that every workshop needs. We're going to make them, use them, and I'll show you why you need them. You just need a couple of pieces of MDF or plywood, a few hardwood offcuts, and if you're feeling fancy, some hardware to go with it. So they don't need to break the bank. So let's get started. The first one we're going to make is not only the simplest, but actually for the past 4 years it's been my most used jig. And it only uses 2 pieces of 18mm ply and a handful of screws. Now, like many of you, I can't afford a track saw or can't justify it, and I can't store full sheets of plywood in my workshop. So this is vital, and it'll be used for all of the jigs that are to come. I'm using a straight edge here to make a few cuts, but that's not vital. If you don't have a straight edge, all you need to do is make sure that you are cutting the top piece off this jig with the factory edge left on one side. That way the straightness of the cut you're actually making is not all that important. In fact, seeing a cut with a straight edge shows exactly why I am making this jig, because that method has one flaw. Take a look at any circular saw and you'll see that there's an offcut from the base to the blade that you have to take account for. This can be fiddly. And also, you'll lose accuracy and it takes longer. And when overlapping the 2 boards to make this jig, you just need to make sure that the gap to the lower one is a little longer than the base to blade offset. This will force the saw to make a cut, and this will end up being the reference line for all future cuts. Now, I don't use glue to fix the 2 boards together, as there is a very good chance that the only part of this jig to ever get damaged is going to be the base. So if you just use screws, this can easily be replaced or repurposed. And for bonus points, just before you screw the pieces together, give that lower edge of the top piece a tiny chamfer. Nothing large enough to affect the direction of the saw, but just a place for some of the fine dust to go so it doesn't push the saw outwards. It's not 100% necessary though. And then, with the jig complete, you can cut away any excess to create your future cut line. And don't forget to mark the edge you're going to use. And it really is that simple. And the blade will always slide along the side of the base plate. So the next cut you want to make, simply line up the side of the base with your cut line and cut away. And that just leaves us with a couple of extra tips. Always place the jig where possible on the side of the board that you want to keep, because the base will actually protect that piece from tear out from the circular saw. Whereas the other side of the cut will suffer from tear out unless you use blue tape. So how this fits into my workflow? Well, I use this to cut down a plywood sheet to just over the perfect dimensions for whatever I'm making. And then once it's cut down to a much easier size to handle, I'll tidy it up on the table saw. Let's move on to our second jig. This one is even simpler than the first. And we're going to cut the plywood using our first jig. Now, I know not everyone has a thicknesser, so I'm not going to dwell too long on this one as it does just perform one job. But if you do have a thicknesser, then this is an absolute game changer. Thicknessers are fairly simple. They dimension a board down to a certain thickness by carving a layer off the top as the boards pass through. But where they can come unstuck is when the board is bowed or twisted. In these cases, you can't simply push a board through, as not only can it leave the board way out of square, but it can potentially be dangerous. That's where we need this jig. And this is just a long piece of 18mm ply that is cut to just under the width of the thicknesser. The uneven board is then fixed to the ply, therefore creating a flat bottom for the thicknesser to reference off. With a twisted board, you can lay it on the ply fixed in one area, and that will kick up the other end or leave the middle raised. You can then wedge these areas with shims and hot glue until the board is secure. Securing the board down is one of the most important things to get right here. And in doing so, you're basically fooling the thicknesser into thinking that the board has a flat bottom. The machine then ensures that the top of the board is flat and parallel to the ply, which can take a number of passes. But once the timber's flat, you can turn it over and pass it through without the sled. With the newly flattened bottom side down, the thicknesser will carve away the top until it is parallel with the bottom. It really is that simple. The only area of construction in this is screwing a piece of wood to the back to act as a stop. This just adds extra support when pushing the board through the machine. I'll leave a link in the description for the hot glue gun because it is cordless and it has served me brilliantly. But in most cases with any larger project, you're not only going to have to dimension the timber on the face sides, but also on the edges. So that way you can glue multiple boards together to make a bigger panel. Say if you're making a tabletop. Now, contrary to what I first believed when I started out, these edges don't actually need to be a perfect 90 degrees for this to work. They just need to meet in a way so that the overall board is flat. So for instance, an 89 degree edge will meet with a 91 degree edge and make the 2 boards overall flat. as the two angles add up to 180 degrees. Now, the most common way that I get this done on thinner boards is to use the book technique and play both edges together so that one angle will counteract the second if there's any error from the desired 90 degrees. But the issue with wider boards here is that the combined width is larger than the width of a jointing handplane. Experts can still joint each board separately. That's well beyond my level. So I need a jig. And this one can be as simple as you want. The basic ingredients are a bit of plywood and a couple of clamps. And with that you have choices. The board can either run along the fence or it can slide in the table saw groove. You line the edge that you wish to be jointed with the edge of the ply, and so long as the ply rides the edge of the table saw blade, then you know you're going to get a nice straight cut on the timber. Not only that, but if your table saw is set up correctly, then the edge will also be square. But here's the clever bit. If you alternate up and down on your boards, you'll also eliminate any angle discrepancies, much like the book technique. How you decide between groove and fence riding is totally up to you. I chose a groove rider as it feels more beginner friendly. Less margin for error and more control. I'll show you that method now. Your hold downs are the first choice to make. If you don't have a router or don't want to buy into the match fit system as I have, then I suggest attaching clamps directly to the board. You lose a bit of versatility, but it is the easiest way. The clamps in the match fit system work off a series of routed dovetail grooves, and I've shown in many videos so far that that is actually a cheaper method than T-track. There is a specialist match fit dovetail bit if you don't mind spending a little extra. I'll link it in the description. How many grooves you make is up to you. There's plenty of meat in an 18mm ply sheet to not lose integrity if you have two along the length and one every 200mm or so like I have. The final piece of the jig is the runner. I'm using hardwood. I'm using sapele for this as I have a few battens lying around. I only cut it close on the table saw, slightly thinner than the depth of the groove, but a little wider. And then I fine tune it up using a block plane. Apply a little wax at the end and it'll slide along nicely without any slop. If it ends up slightly thin or it contracts, in a pinch you can correct this with a few layers of blue tape in the right place. Metal runners or even plastic ones will work better if you experience large swings in temperature and humidity. And finally, when fitting the runner, make sure that the board overhangs the blade just a little. We'll deal with that in a few moments. And like using any sled with runners, you will need to extend the grooves from your table saw into your outfeed table. And don't over tighten the screws because that will risk expanding the runner. Once all that's done, you can run the sled through the saw for the first time to create the cut edge, and with it the reference for all future cuts. With the jig complete, there's a couple of areas that we need to clean up. I've just knocked down some of the sharper edges with my handy scraper card. I'm going to pop a link to that in the description. It is worth noting that the one edge you don't want to knock down is the edge that rides the table saw blade, because this is the reference to your cut line. And if you decide to change a blade for a thinner kerf, you will have to take that into account too. But this isn't a one-trick pony. You can use this jig for angle cuts, jointing, smaller cuts that are not square, and for so many other jobs. And with just a few tweaks, it opens up a whole world of other table saw jigs. And each one of them will increase the range of your table saw, the accuracy, and most importantly, the safety. But power tools are not the only thing that gets better with a jig. You can level up your hand tools too. But don't worry, the next two jigs are not just for hand tool woodworkers. Every woodworker at some stage needs a hand plane and a saw. And a jig can reduce your learning time and cut out errors simultaneously. So let's just get started on the first. This is a shooting board. Don't sleep on it, telling yourself that it's only for pro expert hand tool woodworkers. The truth is, this is for anybody who owns a hand plane. Its job very simply is to square up your wood in both directions, either on the end grain or, if short enough, the long grain. But end grain tends to be its most common use. As to which hand plane works best, well, we're going to come to that shortly. But first, here's how you make a shooting board. And full disclosure, this is Rob Cosman's exact method, no adaptions. He is the expert, and I will link his latest in-depth shooting board build video in the description. All I'm doing is showing you that even someone as inept as me can make it. So I have no doubt that you can too. So here are the ingredients. You'll need a baseboard. Mine is 18mm ply, and I've made two, which will make sense in a little while. Mine are 2 feet by 1 feet in size. And then it doesn't really matter which plane you use at this point, as they are all reasonably similar in height. But do make sure it fits on its side on the edge of the base and doesn't tip off. And then cut a piece of 12mm ply to fill the gap that's left. The straighter the edge that meets the plane, the better, as this will be the reference for the plane to run along. If you run your plane along the edge now, the iron, or blade, will carve into the ply and make your job really hard. So what Rob does, and it is simple genius, is he cuts a rebate along the long edge. I've made mine around 1/2 to 1/3 of the curve of the table saw blade, and I've left 3 mm of wood for the plane to run along. It's clever because the blade of the plane doesn't run all the way to the edge of the sole. This means that the blade can now move along without doing any work until you add your workpiece to be squared. For safety, take your time with this rebate and raise the blade of the table saw little by little, referencing your ply to the plane until you're happy. And now for the glue up. And this is another one of Rob's genius tricks. The plane will snag on the shooting board if it ever curves into a smile as you look from one side. So to combat this, we force a frown. And by that, I mean if your shooting board is lying on a bench, you want it to look like this. You don't want it to look like this in extreme cases. I mean, to the naked eye, it'll probably look flat. Now, Rob uses MDF, which is generally flatter to begin with than ply, so he has to force a frown. Our ply, being fairly cheap, already has a bend in one direction, but we will use the same method anyway. First of all, take the second identical 18mm baseboard that we cut, mark the middle, and then split each of those halves into thirds. We're going to use tape to create a gentle curved form or mould. On the middle line, I'm laying 5 layers of painter's tape, and then they're gradually going to get lower the further away we go. Adjust this number if you've got thinner tape by increasing the layers. So with 5 in the middle, on the next lines out from the middle on either side, we will lay 3 layers of painter's tape, and then on the farthest 2 lines, 1. This creates a very slight hump, and the final part of the trick is to lay everything on your flattest surface you have and lock everything down. Once this is cured, you can release it all and the slight curve will remain. And now we can make the final parts. For the planing stop, you can use any hardwood. It just needs to be a bit harder than pine. And you need to work it so that the front edge is flat and square to the base. For this, I just took my time using a hand plane, taking layers off gradually and testing it with a reliable square. Now, before we attach the plane stop, let's just talk about which plane is best for this jig. The honest truth is it will work okay with any one of these hand planes, though a number 4 and shorter might be a little trickier because of the shortened sole, as this is the part we use to reference square on the wood. Personally, lengthwise I would suggest a number 5 to be perfect. Sadly mine, however, doesn't match the second criteria, which is absolutely vital. As the plane is running on its side on the shooting board, the side needs to be square to the sole for it to work. Now, my newer Stanley Sweetheart plane is square, but I find it much harder to hold on a shooting board because the frog is not upright like on a normal plane. So for those reasons, I use my beat up and welded back together number 7 Stanley, as despite all its flaws, it performs perfectly. But in reality, if all you have is a number 4 plane, you can still make it work. You can see here I've clamped my longest plane to the edge of the 12mm ply layer. This is so I can reference the 90 degrees to the planing stop. And by doing this, we're referencing the rebated 3mm that we left rather than the top edge of the ply. You can reference the top of the 12mm ply and it'll work absolutely fine. I just found that mine was slightly less accurate, maybe 1mm over the width of the planing stop, which is okay. Do take care not to allow the wood to slip when clamping with glue, and leave yourself around 1mm of gap from the iron to the end of the planing stop itself. Once you're happy that it's square and tacked up a little, you can secure it with screws from the back. I've just countersunk mine to avoid scratching. And that's your shooting board, and the last job is up to you. If you wanted to, you could just clamp this straight down onto your bench, or watch the next jig being built and decide you want to use dog holes. But for me, I'm just going to attach another piece of wood to the base. That way it just butts up nicely against my workbench. And then the final thing is to test it out and practice. There are a number of different techniques that people use with these, and this is where I step out of the conversation entirely and say that I recommend how Rob Cosman uses his, and recommend that your next step, if you're new to this, is to take a look at how he does it. But not before we make the next jig, because that's useful too. We're going to call the next jig a bench hook with a twist. For this one, just take the spare bit of plywood that we cut out earlier, as this is going to be the base. You'll need another piece of scrap hardwood that is roughly the width of the board minus around 1.5 inches on either side. You don't have to be exact. This is going to be our saw guide. Now, if you want this to be a simple jig that just helps you cut square, all you need to do is attach that hardwood to the base and you're just about done. But unlike a lot of bench hooks that you see, we're not going to attach the stop to the top of this. As I want mine to be a little bit more user-friendly, I'm going to make a series of cuts on the hardwood first. The first of which is to rip around 1 inch along one edge. This gives us a straight front to the stop. Then, 2 45-degree cuts that are parallel. And notice here that I'm making one crucial error. I'll try and fix that later, but to avoid it from the start, choose a piece of hardwood thick enough to be a little thicker than most of the wood you're going to cut on this jig. Mine here is only around 1 inch thick, 2 would have been better. And to cut the 45-degree angles, I just used my miter gauge, but it's worth noting you could clamp this to the jointing jig or use a miter saw, hand saw, whatever you find is the safest method for you. When I realised my stop was too thin, I decided to cut the top section off to use later to thicken it up. You'll see, it's a little bit of a bodge. To glue everything down, I'm first fixing the straight front so that there is a flat reference for all the other pieces. Everything is held with CA glue for the instant clamp and then wood glue for strength. The angled pieces are glued down, ensuring a saw blade kerf is open between them, and everything is screwed from the back with countersink screws. Pre-drilling the holes is vital with hardwood to avoid splitting. Now you'll start to see why I've placed the strip in the middle rather than at the top. In my woodworking, I tend to use a mixture of Western push action saws and Japanese pull action saws. Each saw requires the wood that you're working on to sit in a different location so that it's supported. And this jig covers both. And here's my quick fix to the thickness issue. Now, like the shooting board, the last job here is holding the jig firm while in use. If you only want to use one style of handsaw and have no intention of ever swapping the board around, then you can simply attach a block on the underside to the jig. For me, I want the versatility, and I also want to test out the use of the dog holes here. Sadly, my benchtop holes are not perfectly spaced, so I need to add a little bit more flexibility. If you have a machine drilled top, CNC maybe, then you may not need to do this and you can simply have 2 dogs attached to the underside of your jig. My workaround though is simple. 1 fixed dog and 1 sliding dog. It's a little bit wobbly, but easily firm enough for this jig. The sliding dog itself is really easy to make. You just need to have the top flush on 2 sides and then wider on the other 2. This one was made when I made a planing stop in the last video. So if you need more details, that's where you'll find them. And please, don't feel like you're ruining this jig by grooving out where the saws finish. That's absolutely normal and expected. And you're going to make a number of these through your woodworking career. But there is a little something that bugs me about this, and for a second I couldn't put my finger on it. You see, I'd convinced myself that if I was using a push saw, it would be on this right hand side. And then if I was using a Japanese pull saw, I'd have to turn it around, and that's why I made it so you could rotate it. But we've already established that a Japanese pull saw can work on this side too, and with the angles. And if you turn the whole thing around, like I'd planned, well, it's no different. It's exactly the same on either side. So some people might say, you've not done what you planned. But me, I'm going to say not only have we made a bench hook that works with push and pull saws, we've also made a spare on the other side. So, one side wears out, flip it round, work on the other side. That's double the efficiency, whichever way you look at it. I think I can get away with that. But there's more. Now, stick with me, because I want to do my usual and over-engineer this a little bit further as a bit of a test. This is technically done. I want to try something. So my big idea here combats the main weakness of this jig for a beginner woodworker, someone like myself. The problem I've always found is that with 1 point of contact, trying to keep a 90-degree cut is not easy. So what we're going to do is make a support piece to enable 2 points of contact to replica the old mitre boxes. I want it to be fairly flexible for the different widths of board we're going to be cutting. And for that, I'm just going to use a series of dowel holes and then my Timu dowel jig, which I confess is having its first outing here. And with 4 points of attachment, I think that's going to be enough. I have to say, this little adaptation actually has worked out brilliantly. I've added 2 right angle pieces to the back because with the smaller dowels and with a thinner piece of hardwood, it does tend to have a little bit of a rock when you're supporting yourself with it. But for me, this has eliminated the greatest weakness for a beginner using a bench hook. Having 2 points of contact instead of 1 makes this far more accurate and far more user-friendly. And remember, you don't have to make it to look like this to be the same shape or size as this. Make it to whichever dimensions suit you. There is one other idea I've had that I haven't tested out for a very good reason. Instead of dowel holes, what about sinking in 2 T-tracks? Then you can adjust the support bar up and down and actually clamp the workpiece you're working on with it. Definitely something worth considering, especially if you're going to be using this a fair amount. I'm not going to do it in this build, but if I find this isn't perfect, you might see it in a future video. So that's your 5 jigs. 2 for your hand tools and 3 for your more powered tools. I will correct one thing that I said at the start. I said these were the 5 that everybody needs. I confess, in practically the same breath, I said not everybody's going to have a thicknesser. I apologise for that. But it does lead to an interesting experiment. Take a look down in the comments. Anybody saying these aren't the 5 for everyone because of that reason, well, you know they didn't watch this far. For every one of you that did watch this far, thank you very much. I really hope you enjoyed the video. I hope there was something useful in there. If you haven't, please click the like and subscribe. And if you like this style of woodworking, I think this video is for you. If you've already seen it, check out this one. Whichever one you choose, thank you so much. I'll see you over there.